how humans conceived that they can predict astronomical phenomena and why. I mean, it's really the recipe on how to create an Antikythera mechanism.
Welcome. AstroTalk UK is a not-for-profit podcast on astronomy, science and spaceflight. Launched in 2008, it's produced by me, Gurbir Singh, a writer based in the UK. I produce this podcast for my own education, but frankly, it allows me to meet fascinating people doing interesting things. It's primarily for my own education, and I share it as a free educational resource. No ads, no subscriptions, and you don't need to log in. For more, see the About page on astrotalkuk.org. Episode 109, The Antikythera Mechanism with Professor Xenophon Moussas. I first came across the Antikythera mechanism just over a decade ago. It is still the most incredible artefact from history. It is as out of place in our time as William Shakespeare using an iPhone or Vasco De Gama travelling in a speedboat. The Antikythera mechanism is a complex mechanical device that can determine the positions of the planets, the phases of the moon, and predict when solar and lunar eclipses will occur. Constructed about 2,000 years ago, it was discovered in 1901. Athens-based Professor Xenophon Moussas has been mesmerized by it since childhood. As a mathematician and a space scientist, he's been involved in using leading-edge technology to reveal its mysteries. In this interview, recorded in Athens during COSPAR 2022, he starts with a short description.
The so-called Antikythera mechanism is a very peculiar object found in a shipwreck that probably sank between 60 to 80 BC in a small Greek island called Antikythera. Originally, the Greeks, for centuries, as we read in the books, used to call it, believe it or not, tablet. Well, in Greek, of course, which is pinakidion, little table, it means. And since I was a child, I used to go to the National Archaeological Museum, where it is on a very beautiful display. And as astronomy was my hobby since I was 10 or something, together with mathematics, that was the greatest love, still is, I had to stop really being mesmerized by this small item, one Greek foot, the same as the imperial one, really. That is an object with gears of the 2nd century BC and with some inscriptions on it. In Greek, very clear letters, 2 millimeters their size, like the present day capital Greek letters. So that was the beginning of my acquaintance with, and probably this instrument guided me as a child to become a physicist and then an astronomer.
Now, I'm guessing that your interest in astronomy and the function of the Antikythera mechanism is what blended those two interests together. What kind of astronomical functions can the Antikythera mechanism perform?
From what we know up to now, we believe that we know quite well all the functions it had concerning the sun, the moon, and the earth.
Right.
it has two phases. It is like a double-phased clock. And it has several scales on both sides. The main function is to show the position of the sun and the moon during the year and during the month. For the moon, it displays in a very realistic way the face of the moon by a little silver sphere, as we read in the manual, that during the month changes phases, and you know, new moon, first quarter, full moon, etc.
So these are the phases of the moon, the relative position of the moon, the planets as well?
For the planets, we are not certain, but the position of the planets, the motions of all the planets, I mean the 5 planets they know in antiquity, are described very well in a small compendium of astronomy that is written on 2 little pages, let's say, made of copper, again sized 1 foot, obviously. And there you have all the details of their motions.
So it's giving you the phases of the moon, the relative positions of the planets. What about eclipses?
We are certain that it predicts eclipses both of the sun and the moon. In fact, for the moon it gives very accurately the places that can be observed on Earth. For the sun, although it predicts that in this given hemisphere of the Earth, let's say, we expect a solar eclipse, we don't have and we cannot have with such a machine the exact time of the eclipse. But the day, month, year are given very well for both types of eclipses.
Now, what's astonishing is that this device you are describing is at least 2,000 years old, and it was only found about just over 100 years ago. So today, if I want to find where the stars are, what time Mars is rising, when we will have another solar eclipse, I would use a planetarium software on my computer, on my tablet. If I was doing this 20, 30 years ago, I would use a device that in the UK called a planisphere, a circular, one circle on top of another circle, which would rotate and show you, depending upon the time of year, which stars are visible and what time they rise and set. Maybe 100 years before that, it's very common to have these orreries, these models of one planet with its moon going around the sun, and you can have a model of a solar system operated by clockwork. So once you start it going, it would just go on and be consistent with the actual times, or at least the relative times of the solar system itself. So what you were describing is essentially a computer that operates with the mechanical gears to such a high precision that it tells you all these things in a very small device, small physical device. What size and what kind of mechanical precisional engineering would have been required to develop and produce and make this Antikythera mechanism 2 centuries ago?
To create such a mechanism, you really need to have a very good metallurgical workshop. and of course mechanic, and people at the time were very capable, and one could really file, well, first of all, cut a disc, let's say, that using a file can become a gear. But before that, you need to know the laws of physics that predict the eclipses, as they understand them at the time, of course. So really periodicities. And then to work out, to program the computer, that is, with gears, with integer numbers, obviously, to perform the appropriate mathematical calculations so that the pointer that is associated with the turning of this or the other gear, and an axe, of course, or a shaft, will show the result on a display, circular, or we also have two spiral displays, one for the phases of the moon, which in fact is the, we could say, calendar we presently use for Easter.
Right.
Believe it or not, is already in the mechanism, and it is a calendar developed in Athens at the time of Socrates. The Greek astronomers, philosophers, start with a model of the cosmos that gives the position of the 5 planets, the sun and the moon, quite well, using spheres one inside the other, mechanical. They take into account the diurnal motion of the Earth around the axis. So the 24 hours, let's say, the year that a human sees the sun going around the Earth during this year. They understand very early in the history of astronomy that this model with the concentric spheres is not sufficient to reproduce the change of the luminosity of, let's say, Jupiter or Saturn or Venus, even more. So they leave this paradigm of the concentric spheres and they go to another one that uses addition of circular motions. So at the time of, let's say, just of Alexander the Great, more or less, they use this addition of circular motions. The mathematics are very simple, and even more important, they can reproduce using gears.
Right.
They know that the trajectories of the celestial objects, the planets, the sun, and the moon, are, even they are circular, are certainly eccentric.
Okay.
That's why they add this extra circle. And believe it or not, today our telephones, for example, use exactly the same mathematics, adding circular motions, well, sines and cosines, in fact,
Right.
to reproduce our voice, to make our voice to bits and bytes and receive it back and make it again a voice so that we can hear. So they developed this beautiful method that in science we call Fourier analysis, Fourier series. And at the time of the Byzantium, for example, they go from 2 circles up to 7,
so
adding for the planets and so on. And this is the method they use for the Antikythera mechanism.
So
it is quite accurate, in fact.
So
not bad.
Thank you for helping me understand that. So this mechanism can be built without the knowledge, or without implementing the knowledge of elliptical orbits. It can be done completely with eccentric circles, piers.
The two, I mean the elliptical orbit and the addition of 2 circular orbits, deviate for the moon, for example, that we have discovered in the mechanism, and this was the first totally unexpected surprise to find that they have a very good approximation of Kepler's second law in the mechanism. And probably they use the same for the planets. We are not certain that it had the planets. Personally, I believe that it certainly had the planets. But this is only an assumption based on the manual and also on several ancient books describing similar instruments.
And so when you, that's really very clear. So despite the fact that the concept of elliptical orbits didn't come until much later, the mechanisms that were inherent in the design of the Antikythera mechanism described accurately what was observable, so it worked fine. When you say the manual, so let's just talk about what kind of writing and texts is on the mechanism itself. So when you say the manual, you're referring to text that's on the mechanism from the time when it was made.
Exactly. So although we only have something like 20 to 30% of what we call manual, because the rest of it hopefully is still at the bottom of the sea, where archaeologists presently, in fact, and we are very grateful to them for continuing this, will find it and give it to us to read it and tell you more about. The manual, despite the fact that it is quite fragmented, we know that it gives, as I interpret it, the laws of physics they use for the eclipses. And this, in fact, is very clear. So 20 years before our study, I wrote that perhaps the mechanism predicts the eclipses and the phases of the moon, because these are written in the manual, you see, and that part of the manual is very clear, so I could read it at the time.
And when you say you could read it, obviously you read Greek, but this text would be in ancient Greek?
Yes, but it is quite simple.
Right.
It is close to the common Greek, let's say, language that they use for science and philosophy, which is based on Ionian, because the first philosophers were Ionians. Even the Dorians, let's say, use the Dorian philosophers frequently use the same dialect or language, if you like. Well, it's really a scientific, let's say, dialect.
Yeah, and if you look back at the ancient texts, and many you refer to, that help to confirm and validate some of the text that you see on the mechanism itself. Are you able to, have you seen a reference to this device, the Antikythera Mechanism, in ancient text or text from the time?
Very many. In Latin as well. Perhaps the most important is few phrases by Cicero in Latin. Cicero had the opportunity to handle, to play perhaps, with two similar mechanisms that he calls spheres, sphere. And in fact, although of course the book is in Latin, he uses the Greek term sphere for the spheres. And he says that they give the position of all the celestial bodies, they predict celestial phenomena, and the motion of the planets is not at a constant speed, neither random, he says. So I interpret this that he really tells us that they predict these machines made by Archimedes, the retrograde motions of the planets as well. And we have similar texts in Greek.
So there's some descriptions of this device in ancient text. Are there any sketches or pictures that you've been able to?
Unfortunately not. Well, there are some descriptions of devices with drawings concerning the design of gears using correct mathematics, how to cut them, and even worm gears and gears that are cut at an angle. And also more complex machines, including valves for automata.
Now, automata, can you explain what that is for?
Robots, let's say.
Yeah, so this is the robots of the mechanical age.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And descriptions of in various books tell us about ancient automata of that type. In one of them, a great mathematician says that this machine, this table, that you can now construct, as you have read already the instructions, will give you the perigee and apogee of celestial objects at the right place and the right time. And when I read that for the first time before our study, I thought that this is an exaggeration, that they could not make such a thing. But the Antikythera Mechanism proves that I was wrong.
How small would a small gear wheel be, and what's the dimension of one of the teeth, for example?
All the teeth are around 2 millimeters or 2.2, something like that. So they are quite small. The smallest gear is of this size. In fact, we have a crown gear, something like that, that has a diameter of perhaps 7 millimeters or something of that order, if I remember well. And of course, archaeologists and all student of mine, Mr. John Bitsakis, and archaeologists, of course, and the chemist of the museum. We managed to have a much better idea about the mechanism. Of course, as always, we had to read the previous studies. Well, the very first one is 1902, 3, 7, 10, 27, 30, and in the 30s, they even constructed the first model made of bronze.
The X-ray investigation allowed you to see inside the mechanism.
Yes.
Did it reveal any additional text, additional writing?
We discovered a lot inside the rust, because as it was at the bottom of the sea, kept by Poseidon, Neptune, for 20-something centuries, of course it has suffered a lot. But with this method, as I promised to the minister when I asked for the permit, we managed to read not only the mathematics that are written in the gears, as I said before, which is very important, because then we know the algorithm and we know the programming of the machine, but also we discover parts of the manual that otherwise are invisible. They are inside the object.
On the doors that open.
Exactly.
You see it. So, what is the material from which most of the mechanism is made from? Is it mostly copper?
Yes, it is bronze, in fact. Some parts are very hard, and this depends upon the percentage of tin used for. And the gears in particular contain a bit of lead. Lead has been used to lubricate the object, as we used to in our cars till a few decades back.
It's very interesting. I didn't know that. Yes,
and very surprising.
And when you're writing with a pencil, it's quite smooth.
Exactly.
So I can see why that would work. I hadn't appreciated that. Are there any additional new technologies that you think which might reveal further information in the coming years?
Yes, definitely. Of course, first of all, I would like to repeat the cities, because now the machine, initially developed by X-Tech, a British company, an excellent British company with their people, Roger Hadland and his colleagues, and I'm continuously grateful to him and to all the team that they came here and worked very hard.
And this is CT, the CT X-ray mechanism.
Exactly.
Computerized tomography.
Today,
we see it in hospitals.
They have developed a much better one that has a resolution that is at least 4 times better.
You mentioned the material from which it was made. I can imagine that because it's so unique and so fragile, that all of the investigations you perform are non-destructive in nature, have to be. Yes. Has there been any metallurgical investigations which might indicate where it was made?
We don't really have for the moment. Of course, we hope that we'll have the opportunity to study it properly. I mean the chemical analysis, as you said, from a distance, because there are now excellent instruments that can do it, and these can indicate, for example, where the tin or the copper came from. Let's say Cornwall or whatever. Well, it's certain.
Yeah.
Because metallurgy was very advanced already in the 3rd millennium BC in Greece and in other places. And if I remember well, they discovered that the tin comes from England, for example. You know that the Greeks call Britain the Tin Islands.
No, I did not know that.
Yes.
I see.
Yeah, and they had to go there to collect it, to buy it, whatever. And the same applies for copper. They collect it from all over the Mediterranean, because the copper that was in Greece has finished well before the mechanism.
Oh, I see.
And probably it has been recycled, because that was very common in antiquity, today as well. I mean, copper at times was more expensive than gold because it can be used for weapons. And of course, during the wars, it was the thing.
More important, yes. So the mechanism was found in Antikythera Island, just south modern Greece, near Crete.
Yes, between Crete and Greece mainland, midway.
Do you have an idea from all the investigations that have taken place of where it originated from, or was it made in?
No, we don't. Well, it was in a huge shipwreck that I call Poseidon's Museum, because it was full of antiquities, taken at the time by the Romans to Rome, obviously, to be, let's say, the triumph of a general, or to his
military
villa.
conquest. Yes.
Exactly. We know that there were coins in there from Pergamon, for example, not only, from Sicily even. Obviously of a merchant or of a rich person that was in the ship. There are also a few but extremely important statues made of bronze. And several amphorae, Rhodes, Kos, and other places. So probably it had wine or olive oil from these places. And it is certain that it went to these islands. Now, Rhodes was famous for metallurgy. The Colossus of Rhodes, we know that has been constructed there because they were very good. So it might be from Rhodes. We also know from ancient books that a very important philosopher who had his school in Rhodes and where Cicero have studied, let's say, sort of postgraduate studies, we could say. Cicero describes a similar mechanism by Posidonius. So that island probably had also a tradition in constructing these sort of things. Now, just opposite in what is now Turkey was the city of Trallis. Now, Trallis was famous for the construction of robots, automata, of various types. And this is a tradition that, according to the Greek books, continues for more than a millennium.
Are you confident that it was made in Greece and traveling somewhere within Greece, or was it something that was made outside Greece coming into Greece?
Oh, it's the other way around. I mean, the ship is a a huge one, as we said, full of treasures taken from several parts of Greece, we can imagine.
Right.
And going to Rome, where Greek things were in fashion for centuries, really. Even almost a millennium before the mechanism, Greek items were in fashion in Italy. Of course, the roots of the mechanism, the concept, the design, the blueprint, let's say, might very well have been by Archimedes.
Right.
And it certainly had roots in Alexandria, where we have the library and the museum. The museum really means university.
Yeah.
It's the place where they study science and philosophy. As I like to say, the best example of Pythagorean philosophy.
And here again, by philosophy, you refer to modern day science.
Yes. I mean, when I had the opportunity to give the very first lecture to the students of physics at the University of Athens, I used this phrase: you will all become more Pythagoreans than Pythagoras himself. Now they don't understand me, of course. And I continue explaining. Pythagoras, according to our history, is the first one, although I don't believe he was the first, but anyway, this is what history says. The very first one to say that nature can only be understood using mathematics. In fact, he used the term arithmetic, meaning measuring exactly with numbers.
We have this Antikythera Mechanism. It's in the National Museum here in Athens. Has anything else similar to that been discovered elsewhere, since or before?
We can say that there are some sort of parts of similar mechanisms. One of them is a sort of part of a sphere with a hole here that is eccentric, by the way, with the months as they are in the mechanism, and the months as we use them today, I mean the Latin months, written in Greek, with handwriting of, well, around 230 AD. So, 4 centuries after the mechanism. After. And what else? With the zodiac exactly with the same names as in the mechanism. I guess that this was part of a celestial sphere or something like that, because it really is like a piece of a sphere with the ecliptic, with the eccentric, with the perigee and apogee of the Earth properly, found in a what they call Roman villa near Dijon, France. In many ancient houses there, you can find numerous Greek mosaics. So it was a place where there were many people and wealthy people, obviously merchants. And one of them had this mechanism. And another one I have discovered, believe it or not, in Reykjavik.
Oh, that's unusual, yes.
There I discovered in the National Museum of Reykjavik. So there are 3 wooden mechanisms in Reykjavik. The director of the museum told me that these were made probably around 1780, plus or minus 20 years.
Okay.
Now, exactly the same thing, our colleague that helped us to read the writings of the Antikythera Mechanism, Dr. Tsilikas, gave me exactly the same date.
Now, you were saying earlier that the original site of the find near the Antikythera island is still being searched by archaeologists today. And you mentioned that the head of Hercules, the statue, was discovered there recently. What kind of research activities are going on? This is underwater.
Yes.
What kind of research activities have been going on for the last? Have they been going on for the last few years? Is it ongoing all the time?
Yes, for several years, and they have just started a 5-year period. They usually go there in May and September, because then is the appropriate time period for this time of activities underwater. The seas are very rough there, and the light as well of the sun makes sometimes difficult for them to work, despite the fact that they are at a depth of 40 to 65 meters. Now, there one can see the remains of the ship that are of around 45 meters by 10 to 16, a depth of perhaps a meter. Of course, many debris, sand, seashells, you name it, little and larger stones, together and conglomerated with antiquities. And the actual ship was unique in many ways. It was covered, the keel, by lead, very expensive. The wood is 14 centimeters and extremely well made.
I just want to finish off now with a few things about you personally. Do you remember how old you were when you first saw the mechanism?
Probably 10.
10.
Yes.
And did it have any impact on you at the time?
Enormous, I believe.
Right.
I mean, I like to say that I have been mesmerized by the mechanism because I love astronomy since that time. I even constructed, when I was in the primary school, a telescope. And my mother introduced me to astronomy initially, and then of course I started with books. And so this mechanism, called at the time the astrolabe. Now, literally, this means in Greek an instrument that enables you either to touch or to catch stars.
Well, in a way.
So it was really something magic in my mythical. Well, then I started with it, and probably this pushed me to become a physicist and then an astronomer.
And you worked on a lot of the missions, space missions for NASA.
Yes, our team at the University of Athens has a very long tradition in space physics. And I had the opportunity to work for a few years initially at Imperial College at the then Cosmic Ray and Space Physics group, as it was called, and later in the Astrophysics group with Professor John Quimby.
So starting with the Antikythera Mechanism at age 10, and then through astronomy and science, it's really literally taken you to the stars.
Exactly. The Antikythera mechanism in many ways is the real time machine.
Professor Xenophon, you've taken us through a wonderful journey, sharing your experiences with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much as well.